Today is January 20th, 2025, and this is episode 293 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bell. How are you, sir?
I'm awesome. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's MLK Day here in the States, so in honor of Martin Luther King. So I actually have a day off work, which is lovely. So I'm spending it here. Too. That's true.
I guess we should have given our rapper disclaimer already, which is that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not those of our employers.
That's true. And, maybe someday it would be if somebody wants to pay us enough, but nobody has yet. So Atlanta, once again, might get snow. Look, I preluded for their last snow event. My neighbors hadn't even restocked. It was very slim pickings when I went out looting this morning.
That's unfortunate. I did see a polar bear frozen to the ground outside.
That was just a Coke promotion.
It's quite cold here in the South. And I know it's pretty much cold everywhere except Australia. So.
At least for us, it's cold. At least in Atlanta. Like right now at my house, it's, as we're recording, 27 degrees Fahrenheit out.
Yeah. But, when we lived in Michigan, that would have been T-shirt weather.
Right. That was like, open the pool. It's springtime. Let's go.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's cold here.
It is. And I think it got down to with wind chill, -5 overnight.
Anyway, let's...
we're the old men talking about the weather. That's what we've turned into.
That's right. All right. So let's go ahead and get into some stories. Our first story for today comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is Hotelier Data Breach Exposes Info Hotel Reservations of Millions. So the story here is that back in July of 2024, way back in 2024, this company named Hotelier, which is a hotel service company that's used by many well-known hotel brands like Marriott, Hilton, and Hyatt. And apparently they store all sorts of sensitive data in S3 buckets. Happened here is that a adversary was able to obtain credentials to access the data in that bucket, and it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 terabytes of customer data spanning multiple different hotel brands. And that happened as a result of a credential phish or credential stealing malware. It's a little unclear exactly how the initial credential theft occurred, but apparently the credentials were stolen for their Atlassian, for this company's Atlassian instance, and that Atlassian instance allegedly contained the credentials to the S3 bucket. And we know this because the adversary here apparently was discussing this with the reporter here on Bleeping Computer, and then they also found some corroborating information on one of the threat intelligence providers that showed credentials had been obtained for this Hotelier company. So it's a little unclear exactly how many individual people were impacted, but it's believed to be in the millions, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, it feels just like another day, another data breach. But the way I read this, though, it sounds like the bad actors got access to Atlassian, which if you don't know Atlassian, you might know it by Confluence or Jira or a few other apps. That's what they're best known for. So it sounds like they got into the Atlassian servers, guessing they were the cloud version, and looked through there for tickets or Confluence articles that had credentials and went to town. So maybe don't store your credentials in your Jira tickets. Crazy idea, I know.
I think that, again, we're hypothesizing here, so just take that with a grain of salt. But the initial credential phish was probably exacerbated by lack of two-factor authentication, right? Given the way this is described, which is that it was stolen via credential harvesting malware on devices, it is quite likely that even traditional multi-factor authentication would have been effective at preventing this. But again, it's a little difficult to say without knowing the specifics about how it happened. But then, as you said, once they had that access, they were able to get access to the credentials to the S3 bucket. So I think the other issues we've said in the past repeatedly now, especially with cloud services where things are spread out on the internet, but this certainly applies broadly to everything. Better credential management is becoming really imperative. So having that sort of thing, in my experience and where I have been responsible, would have been stored in some sort of a password vault where you would have had to have access, logical access to check out an ID to ultimately get access to that S3 bucket. Now, again, we don't know all the details here, but it certainly looks like there were opportunities to prevent this. I think one of the challenges, and this is playing the other side, right? From an efficiency standpoint, we often take the easy way. And so my strong suspicion is that they were storing a list of resources with their associated access credentials, like S3 buckets. And they did that as uh, just as a time saving and an efficiency thing. And until something like this happens, I don't think it's a lot of thought by many IT teams.
Well, it was very efficient for the bad actors.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what irritates me is that we all seem to learn the same lesson over and over and over again. And I, which I guess is why we're here doing this podcast, but it just seems like there's a lot of opportunity to do it better so this doesn't happen.
Yeah, I would agree. Put your secrets in a password vault and then post the password to the password vault in your Atlassian server.
That's true. Or if you do like everybody else, you just leave your S3 buckets open to the internet. And that way they don't actually have to hack in and steal credentials. They can just access the data. It's kind of like, the stories about people who leave their cars open so that the bad guys don't have to smash out the windows to try to steal stuff.
Look, you do what you got to do.
Right.
It is also interesting that 7.8 terabytes of data was transferred out unnoticed. There's a few opportunities for detection here that I think were missed.
Yep. There's a little more information. 39 million rows in a reservations table and a user table containing 212 million rows, which with 1.3 million unique email addresses among the 212 million. So
that's a lot of data.
That's a heck of a lot of data. Again, I suspect there's going to be some sort of an investigation, which dovetails into the next story, which also comes from Bleeping Computer. The title here is FTC orders GoDaddy to fix poor web hosting security practices. So I just kind of play on the last story, which was about Hotelier. But when a company has a high profile breach, which certainly that one, the Hotelier one was, the FTC often, at least in the US, gets involved to assess whether there were material deficiencies. And if there are, they will typically file a lawsuit, and then that lawsuit gets settled through a consent agreement where the company that had the breach ends up having to make material improvements to their security program. And that's what happened here with GoDaddy. So GoDaddy over the years has had quite a few data breaches for those of you who have been following along at home. And following one of the most recent ones, the FTC got engaged and they sued GoDaddy over their security practices. And they just recently reached an agreement. And the agreement, by the way, is linked in this article, which you can find a link to the article on our website at defensivesecurity.org. It contains about 10 pages. The whole document is about 14 pages long, but about 10 of the 14 pages are just chock full of specific individual requirements that GoDaddy has to implement. Things such as they have to implement and maintain a centralized system component inventories, including hardware, software, firmware elements. They have to track out of date and vulnerable versions of software. They have to implement a SIM. They have to conduct regular risk assessments. They have to engage third party assurance partners, basically third party auditors. So they have to disconnect anything from their network that is end of life. And I guess there's a little out that says unless they really can't do that, they have to implement some sort of mitigating controls. But what struck me is like that this touches almost every aspect of security, and it kind of leads me to wonder what the heck was going on there. And then I got to realizing, like, I remember all of those GoDaddy ads, and they're probably spending all their money on commercials, not on
Look,
security.
pretty girls doing softcore porn for your ads are not cheap.
That's true. That's very true.
I was also thinking, in all seriousness, we often talk about, hey, what is due diligence? Like, what is the level of security that a various government agency with regulatory power wants you to have to prove that you're running a well-run program? I feel like this is a pretty good list. Now, obviously, it's specific to GoDaddy's failings, but I think if you're a going concern, you could look at this and say, if we're not doing any of these things, these might be table stakes that the FTC wants us to be doing, or we could get in a lot of trouble.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of like, now the next thing I think about is, okay, you could have a SIM, but how well run is that SIM? You could have an asset inventory, but how accurate is it? You could have vulnerability management, but then it gets into the efficacy and how well those things are executed and run, and how well they're being managed in the care and feeding. The risk of something like this is GoDaddy could go buy a bunch of stuff and install it and then never touch it, which is the downside. But at least gives you an idea of what the government thinks of as reasonable security for a company this size.
Yeah, it does. There are some prescription. It doesn't just say, you have to go purchase a SIM. It does say that you have to enable monitoring, analysis, and investigation and reporting of unlawful or unauthorized system activity. So there's a little bit of prescription in there. And obviously, if you don't follow the order, I mean, the company basically here is making a legal agreement that they're going, as a result of that lawsuit being dropped, they're agreeing to do these things. And so if they go back on that agreement, that's going to cause them, GoDaddy, a lot of problems, or really any company that's in this kind of situation. But I will say, I've been in many audit situations over the years, and even with internal audits and to some extent external audits, and I've also been in regulatory audits. It is a very different thing when, especially a regulator comes out and says to you, hey, like, you should have an inventory of your systems, versus, hey, did you know that your inventory is missing a few systems? Like, those are very different things. And I'm, nothing in here, at least that I've read, I haven't read every single word on the pages, but nothing in here was like, you have a thing and it could use some improvement. It was like, you're lacking that thing.
Yeah.
Like, a
The
thing is
very
just not,
basics.
it's just not there. It's just not there.
Very foundational controls are just not there.
So I can't guarantee that, if, like what you said, that, they go off and they spend a bunch of money and kind of put a veneer on it and then have a similar problem. Like, would they create another one of these documents that has the next layer down of prescription? I don't know, but that's not what we've seen with these consent agreements with, with GoDaddy or most of the other companies. They're like, you have a giant hole and you've got to go patch that because it's bad. I don't recall ever seeing, like, you need to improve the effectiveness of this thing that you have in place. And so, to your point, I think this is a really good roadmap of what the FTC would expect you to have, because it's pretty comprehensive. It doesn't deal with a lot with like development processes. And so perhaps there's maybe some other government agreements that we could look at to fill in that aspect. But like, from an infrastructure standpoint, this is quite comprehensive. It feels like there wasn't a lot in place, which is,
I agree.
Unfortunate if you were a GoDaddy customer.
GoDaddy put out an interesting statement, though, quoting GoDaddy has a long history of offering innovative products to our web hosting customers. We are focusing on protecting our customers' data and websites. We invest significant resources in technology tools and talent to help safeguard systems and information. We are constantly improving our security capabilities and have already implemented a number of the requirements in our settlement agreement with the FTC. Notably, the resolution of this matter includes no admission of fault and no monetary penalties.
because that makes it all okay.
Mm-hmm.
Makes it all
So
okay.
that always cracks me up. Like, we didn't do anything wrong. However, we're going to do all these things that they told us to do. But we didn't do anything wrong.
So look, at the end of the day, they were the victim of a crime, but their bank was robbed, but they didn't lock the door to the bank, or they didn't lock the vault.
Yeah. You bring up, like, this is the argument we constantly have, on this show. And then, in my head, it's like, they were the victim of a bad actor. It's not like they were committing internal fraud or they were, embezzling, or like a bad actor came and molested them. So, there's an aspect here of sometimes in InfoSec, we often blame the victim because, wow, they were just so stupid not to do X, Y, Z. But I
think the reason the FTC gets involved is because there's either an explicit or an implicit assertion by that company to the public that they are doing the security thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the FTC finds their niche.
Yeah.
With these.
Yeah, it's a tough problem. Like I know that we have talked a lot about how do you know what is sufficient to keep the government happy, like in the event of a breach where you did do sufficient due diligence and you still got owned versus you just didn't even do
it's like the
basics.
PCI, like the whole PCI thing that we talked about many years ago. And I think it's perhaps less the case today, but for quite some time, you really couldn't be PCI compliant and suffer a breach at the same time, because if you suffered a breach, it implied that some aspect of your PCI program was not operating effectively, and therefore you were retroactively non-compliant with
which is somewhat nonsensical, like in the age of a 0 day on your firewall.
Right. So in the article here, it does say the FTC says the Arizona-based company, which is GoDaddy, claims of reasonable security practices also misled millions of web hosting customers because GoDaddy was instead, quote, blind to vulnerabilities and threats in its hosting environment due to its failings to implement standard security tools and practices. And that's the core of why the FTC went after them. It's basically misrepresenting themselves in the marketplace. Not that they were necessarily, breached, I guess. That they were saying, like, you can trust us. And then when you look behind the curtain, there's really not a lot there.
It's like they lied on the online dating profile.
Which never happened.
They weren't actually 5'11".
Oh, goodness. All right. The next story comes also from Bleeping Computer. Yes, yet another trend on where Jerry spends his time. Now, the title is Hackers.
It's also my fault. I send you a lot of these, and I don't know.
No, it's all good. It's all good. They have good stuff. Look, they have
no,
good
they
stuff.
do. No, it's like, just for behind the scenes, I have an RSS reader. I use Feedly, and I have probably 40 different InfoSec press stuff I go through. And I think Bleeping Computer just happens to be higher in my sort. And so I could find the same story in 6 different feeds, but I get to them first often. So, but they do a fine job. We like the fine folks at Bleeping Computer.
They are a quality news outlet, and I'm sure somebody will tell me why that was a horrible thing for me to say, but I like them until I find a reason not to. So the title here is, if I can get back there, Hackers Leak Configs and VPN Credentials for 15,000 FortiGate devices. Fortinet just can't catch a break.
Just give up.
Well, I made the comment on Mastodon a few days ago about how it's getting to be too risky to have a firewall in your network. And actually, it was in response to yet another Fortinet 0 day that was being actively exploited, which, by the way, is not what this article is about. So this article was actually about a set of apparent 0 days that happened in the 2022 timeframe. It's a little unclear if they were 0 days at the time of the breach, but the threat actor here at the time had connected to and stolen configuration and credential information out of about 15,000 Fortinet devices. Now, the reason this is now news 3 years after it happened is that they just recently posted these information publicly. And so it's probably a little bit out of date. But I thought the more interesting thing to talk about was that it happened in the first place. Like this was very clearly a methodical. I mean, you don't connect to 15,000 devices by hand and root through them. There were very clearly some kind of a systematic attack to connect to, breach, and then pull back the information. And it was very neatly categorized by country and version and whatnot, including credentials to access the VPN through these devices. And so I thought it was a good talking point on making real some of the challenges, some of the vulnerabilities that have been beleaguering Fortinet devices. And look, it's not just Fortinet. It's been happening to Cisco's and Palo Alto's and other device manufacturers as well. Not trying to necessarily pick on Fortinet, although they do seem to be finding themselves in this spot quite a lot, and maybe even more than most other companies. But this is a real problem. Like when one of these vulnerabilities happens, it's not theoretical. The actors are going out there and at scale, they're compromising and collecting your information, and you may not even realize that it's happened because it quite often happens before you're even aware that there was a vulnerability in the first place, let alone a patch for the vulnerability. And then you become aware and you patch the device, and what you don't know is that somebody's already downloaded all the information for it and they have ongoing access because they've stolen credentials out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like typically what we see is when somebody gets some sort of initial access like this, there's a whole market out there to sell that information. So to dump it like this is not typical. Either they didn't feel it was worth it, or they wanted to do it to like get their name out there, which kind of is implied, but who knows? They're bad actors. You can't necessarily take everything they say at face value. But yeah, as far as I know, I don't think we picked up any chatter back then about a widespread O-Day on Fortinet that allowed this sort of data collection or widespread exploitation activity, follow-up exploitation activity. It makes you wonder, like, how often these are sitting, how often is this sitting out there in the world that we don't know about for other vendors and other tools? And yeah, I don't know. But to your point, it's aged a bit, but I would wager at least half of these creds probably have never changed.
Right.
Yeah.
As I was thinking about it, these devices are the thing that separates or protects our networks, and they quite often is in this instance are the means by which we connect into our network through a VPN. And in this instance, some of the information that was stolen were the credentials to log in. Now, I don't know exactly if they were hard coded in the Fortinet device or if they were able to pull them out of memory and they were using Active Directory authentication or Radius or what have you. That part is not at all clear to me. But to me, it portends perhaps a different response when we find out that there was a 0 day that was under active exploitation that could result in a certain class of incident on our firewalls, that perhaps we have to take a more methodical response when those happen, which would, perhaps include like rebuilding the device or, reflashing it and rotating any credentials and so on. Because in this instance, we don't learn until 2 years later. Now, presumably, if somebody was going to attack you using the information that was stolen, you probably already suffered the breach. What we don't know is how often that happens, because a lot of, unless like you're a GoDaddy or an hotelier, your story isn't made public. But I think there's a lot, probably hundreds of times more breaches that never see the light of day in the media that we don't hear about.
Yeah, which is an interesting problem we've talked about from time to time of if your security program is just chasing what the media is reporting as the latest shiny to go secure, you're probably missing a lot of stuff. And
Right.
we're all guilty of it. Hell, this show is somewhat based on this concept of talking about things that are in the media and taking the lessons learned from it. But
Right.
there's probably a very small percentage of actual threat actions that make any sort of widespread media coverage.
But I think it's a representative sample. Even though it's not necessarily comprehensive, it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that are going on out there. And look, the other thing that I gave a talk in Raleigh a couple of weeks ago now, and one of the takeaways that I had hoped to impress on people was that, while we talk about these attacks and exploits and vulnerabilities here, this isn't comprehensive. Like, we spend an hour or take a week talking about a certain small set of things. I think the more important takeaway is there's a lot of the stuff that's out there and happens, and I I want not only to have a discussion about what happened and what can we learn, but also my hope is that people take away the reality that this stuff is out there for you to go read about and think about. You don't have to necessarily wait for people to talk about it on a podcast to learn about it.
Yeah.
And kind of learn, figure out what your lessons are. I sincerely want people to learn that there is a hot pan on the stove and not touch the hot pan. And if, just because Jerry and Andy don't talk about the hot pan on the stove, it's still there, and you can learn that it happened. And look,
yeah, your stoves and your pans may be very different than ours.
Exactly. Maybe it's not a cast iron pan. Maybe it's a fancy Cuisinart pan, or I don't know if those are even fancy. Whatever.
Yeah, it's, the other takeaway I look at from this kind of story is have in the back of your mind the concept of your key perimeter control failing. What sort of next level detection would be useful in that case? If you had a bad actor get in, how else could you notify that? How would you? They have typical patterns. And if you look at like MITRE's, one of many examples of like a framework of a typical attack chain. So one, if you have the cycles and the skill set, one interesting activity is, all right, let's assume that a bad actor has silently and fully compromised my perimeter and now is inside of my so-called, crunchy exterior shell. What would they do and how might I detect them?
Right.
And then work to build that sort of thing up. So it's not that we just want to just assume that all of our controls suck. But this goes back to the old concept of defense in depth. If right now we're dealing with an epidemic of perimeter firewalls having problems, this is somewhat cyclical. Like, we have these trends that go different areas at different times. Right now, firewalls are taking their turn in the barrel for whatever reason. I don't know all the confluence of events have brought us to this massive confluence, again, I'll use that word, of problems being found in firewalls. Maybe it's just sort of like leading others. One person finds it and other people start auditing those areas, or I don't know. I don't know what the correlating trend is, but nonetheless, it's a good example of don't put all your trust in that particular control. How do I back it up with other detection or preventative controls? Which is a long way to say defense in depth.
Yeah. I don't know how much longer to expect we're going to see these firewalls just being hammered, but I don't see any evidence of it slowing down. And it certainly seems like these class of enterprise firewalls have enough vulnerabilities in them to keep it going for a while.
Well, I would like to think that the manufacturers are spending more of their attention shoring up and finding these problems because of this widespread exploitation, but maybe that's naive.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't know. We don't know what goes on behind the scenes. Like, we there could have been 1,000, and they're fixing 100 of them a month, and it's just a foot race.
I'm pretty sure it's like the dancing scene in Quest for the Holy Grail and Camelot, where they're all just dancing on the round table. That's what I think is happening.
God.
That's part of the agile process, isn't it?
think it is.
The
Yeah.
deployment dance.
Right.
Yeah.
We call that a scrum, I think.
Oh my. We'll just
All
cut
right.
this out. I don't think this needs to make the
Agree. I agree. All right. Our next story comes from cybersecuritynews.com. And the title here is Hackers Exploiting Companies' Google Ads Accounts to Serve Malicious Ads. Now,
I've noticed you're listening to our show with your ad blocker on. Don't you want to support our show? Can't you please turn your ad blocker off? No.
That's right. That's right.
Until you can assure me that no malicious ads could ever exist in the ecosystem, my ad blocker stays on. Thank you.
There you go.
Sorry, I completely stepped on your introduction.
So the story here is that there's a new trend emerging where criminals are targeting the Google ad accounts of legitimate companies. They're taking over those accounts and they're replacing the company's legitimate ads with their own ads that are malicious in some nature. And while that sounds not incredibly complicated, the way that they perpetrate this is a little more advanced. They are first configuring the ads in such a way that is difficult for Google to detect that they are in fact malicious. They're using multiple steps. They're using some code that detects if the origin of the request for the ad is coming from, let's say, a bot like a Google bot or certain geographies. They will actually present a real ad, a legitimate ad, and that they'll limit the malicious ads to only what they believe to be their target, the bad actors' target audience. But ultimately, the end game here is to present ads for what looks like popular software, and they gave some examples like Wordly, Grammarly, and a couple of others, which you wouldn't necessarily be surprised to see an ad for. But if you go and you click on it, you are presented with a legitimate looking site. It would appear to you to be a legitimate site. Obviously, the URL will be a little bit different. But when you go to download the thing, instead of getting a legitimate copy of Grammarly, you're getting some sort of malware. And then, of course, you're wholly dependent on your anti-malware software being able to detect and defend that, which is not a good thing to count on these days. So I kind of go back to the point that I've said, I don't know, several weeks, maybe several months ago, that it's 2025 now. And here we are saying once again that ad blockers, especially in a corporate environment, but I'll extend it to all environments, is not just for convenience, right? Or to clean up the browser page or to reduce the tracking of your activities. But it's also a security precaution because it is and has been kind of a cyclical method of adversaries delivering attacks against your computers. The nature in which that's happened has evolved over time. It used to be the ads themselves were the carriers of malicious code. And now it's enticing you to download something that looks legitimate but is actually malicious. So
Yeah, it's almost like a.
But
I was going to say it's like it's combining a supply chain attack with like a watering hole attack using trusted attack channels, and it's very frustrating to me that these large ad providers can't get a handle on this. We've seen over and over that this is a source of a lot of pain. At some point, I know you can't stop all bad actors and whatnot, but this is just such a common attack profile that it makes you wonder if Google's like, man, there's just an acceptable amount of risk we're willing to accept because it's too expensive or too hard to stop it. So, sorry.
And I suspect it's difficult to definitively track back the source of the infection in all instances, unless you have, some attribution like this particular article. But it's like there's two victims here. There's the company whose ad account got taken over because they're paying real money for an adversary to display malicious ads to the other class of victims.
Which also hurts their brand reputation.
Right. And
Yeah.
meanwhile, Google
And
is like, just send me more money.
well, you would need to sign up for this class of service where we'll protect you for that. What's interesting to me too is so usually these start with some sort of phishing attack against whoever's running the Google Ads account. Mm-hmm. Typically, these are not highly technical people. They're usually not people in the IT department. They're usually like marketing folks or non-technical folks. So they're less likely to know that this risk exists. They're less likely to have strong two-factor authentication enabled. This is one of those things where IT and security departments probably need to dig a little deeper into these non-technical areas and try to help those departments with, for lack of a better term, requirements to turn on these additional security protocols, which may seem like such a pain in a hassle for something that seems like such low risk. But we keep seeing these things that are seemingly low risk, that are not centrally managed, be an avenue for this sort of supply chain attack. So, I mean, as much as it sucks, it almost makes me think, if you're a company of any size, you've got to mandate everybody use every two-factor they can to at least make this harder. Now that is foolproof, we see plenty of new attack techniques that are built to get around multi-factor authentication, but it makes it harder, right? And this stuff is so simple when it's just a single factor and it's a single fish that is usually going towards less technical people who don't necessarily even know the sensitivity of what they're dealing with because it's not their core competency. So I don't know. It feels like there's so many small little areas that can get you bit if you don't run it just right.
Yeah, I agree. And then on the consumer side, on the web browser side, it's also getting to be a little bit challenging because certain sites like YouTube won't let you, they just won't work if you run an ad blocker that actually blocks ads that they display. And I think we're starting to see more and more sites innovating in that direction. But at the same time, it's becoming perilous, especially from the perspective of an enterprise. It's certainly an issue for individual people and consumers, but people and consumers are going to make their own choices, which often won't be fully informed. But on the enterprise side, on the business side, allowing this creates a hazard, right? Especially if it's non-essential browsing, I guess is what I'll call it. That can put your business and your customers at risk. And so I think there's a response here that we have to implement. And I think candidly, running ad blockers at an enterprise level is becoming, and I would argue is way past time to be just table stakes.
I would agree. And I also noted that you used the qualifier candidly. Is that implying that you weren't candid through the rest of our conversation?
Yes. Guilty as charged.
That's fair. No, but to your point, yeah, if you're centrally managing your IT stack, I do think a good solid ad blocker is helpful. However, it's interesting because a lot of people run Chrome, and Chrome is making it more difficult for certain ad blockers. So you've got to stay on top of that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, Chrome is from Google, and Google's business is advertising. So, like, they don't want to cut their nose off. So, for our last story, I wanted to do something a little different because normally we end on a kind of a sour note. And so this time I found a quite interesting blog post about, I guess, what I'll call detection engineering. And it's how basically you can create a canary to proactively identify that there may be somebody, some actor doing things inside your network. And so this story here is from the Black Hills Security blog. Black Hills, by the way, is a pretty interesting company. One of the I think it was a founder wrote a book that's kind of along these lines a couple of years ago, and it had some interesting ideas. So this to me seemed like it was in the spirit of that. I'll see if I can find the title of the book and stick it in the show notes. Probably kind of long in the tooth by now. I think it was maybe 10 years ago. But The deal here is, um, so this blog post walks you through creating a canary account in an Active Directory environment, and it's not just like a um, the normal blog post. It actually teaches you how to stand up a lab environment in Azure using a set of scripts that you can download and create this environment. And it walks you through kind of front to back how to configure this account to detect Active Directory enumeration, to detect Kerberoasting and service principal attacks, and then to detect password spray attacks. And you do that all by enabling certain attributes on just even one Active Directory account, and then configuring your monitoring to look for the events, certain event types associated with that account, because that account would be dedicated to the purpose of being this canary. You really shouldn't expect to see those certain event types happening with that particular account. And when it does happen, when and if it does happen, that would be a high fidelity alert that should cause you to go and perform some investigation. And I've seen this work quite effectively in the past. But one of the challenges because we did this in the past, one of the challenges you run into in larger environments is you can get the alert, but Microsoft very helpfully doesn't actually tell you where the event originated from. And so the alert will tell you that you need to go launch an investigation, but then you have to go through a pretty arduous process of kind of tracking back where the thing originated from, and that can be a little excuse me, that can be a little challenging to do. Anyway, I thought this was a good way to end the podcast here.
Yeah, it was really cool, and I appreciate you throwing it on the end here as a more positive, like, cool technique. And I think it also teaches you a lot about how AD works and the attacks against AD. And this is a good exercise to test some red teaming activities or purple teaming activities too. So it's a lot of good stuff, and it's well worth doing. Now, obviously, not everybody's in Azure, not everybody has this particular risk profile, but there's some neat stuff here, and I appreciate you bringing it up and adding it onto the show.
Yeah, I'd like to find. I haven't seen one, but I can imagine that we could do something similar with, let's say, Unix accounts or Linux accounts. It'll be a little bit, obviously, a little bit different because by default Linux IDs aren't federated, and so each one tends to be its own island, and so you'd have to configure that canary on all the systems that you care about in order to have a full view. But the concept of being able to detect malicious activity or suspected malicious activity on your network, I think, is quite important. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying a couple of minutes ago about what is your response in the context of your perimeter controls failing. Like, what is the next thing that they do? And this, by the way, is one of those next things. Once an adversary gets in, many companies or many organizations of any kind are Microsoft shops to some level. And so they will go through a process of enumeration and just scanning, looking for what their next step is going to be. And that, as a defender, is your opportunity to detect that they're there, because they often have to do something. Like they don't usually go from hacking your firewall to just completely owning your environment. There's some other steps in there. So this is a good opportunity, and perhaps a good set of steps that you may be also applicable in other types of environments, even if it's not directly applicable, for you to think about how to implement in your own environment.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I like it. There might be some other prerequisites here of certain types of logs being available in certain tiers of service and such, just
Mm-hmm.
as a qualifier, caveat, or disclaimer, as it were.
For sure, for sure, but worthwhile. So I was hoping to find something that actually helped, and not just throw another pile or another problem on your pile. So hopefully this does help a little bit. But that is the show for today. We made
Nice.
it.
We did. We survived. And I know we didn't say this at the top, but I know you're not feeling super hot, so appreciate you struggling through the show today.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Sorry for, I know I coughed in everybody's ear, and I apologize for that. It's that season of the year. So, also,
we'll
by the way, speaking of thanks, thank you to our Patreon donors. Love you guys. And ladies. And thank you.
Really appreciate your support. It goes a long way. As you guys know, we don't have any sponsors or ads. That's an intentional choice to try to make sure nobody can edit our commentary or have editorial control over what we talk about. Having those folks willing to cover the costs really goes a long way. And it's kind of non-trivial. I'm not whining. We choose to do it. This is a labor of love for us, and we knew that signing up. We've reached a certain amount of subscribers and listeners that hosting costs actually do add up after a while. So thank you. We really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. And you can find links to the stories we talked about on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Just look for episode 293. You can follow me on the Fediverse. It's at Jerry at infosec.exchange. And where can they find you?
I am also on the Fediverse at Lerg at infosec.exchange, L-E-R-G, and also on X, L-E-R-G. And hey, we've got this other show we do called Getting Defensive, where we interview people.
It's awesome, yes.
If you haven't checked it out, please do. It's on a different podcast feed but it's on the same YouTube channel. Check it out. We've got a show that should publish this week. And hey, if you know some interesting folks doing some work in the trenches that you think we should talk to, let us know. We're open to cool ideas of interesting people to talk to. We're trying to stay away from anything salesy, anything pitchy, anything, like snake oilish or anything like that. We're not really interested in talking to vendors so much. We're more interested in talking to folks doing the work in the trenches every day and learning from them and all the cool ideas they have that Jerry and I are not smart enough to have. So let us know.
Exactly. And I think we've had some really awesome guests so far. I think if you have not had a chance to listen to them, I definitely recommend it. It's gettingdefensive.com. And on our YouTube website, it's at Defensive Podcasts. You can find them there as well.
We're all over the place. You just can't hide.
Yeah, apparently Pornhub is becoming a great place to host this kind of stuff too, even if it's not its normal thing. So,
well, you usually record with your pants off, so it seems on brand.
Well, I'll just have the camera pointing down at my feet the whole time.
We might have to charge more.
We won't have to be so reliant on donations then.
That's true.
All right.
jerrysfeet.com coming soon.
Only feet. Oh, yep. All right, everybody. Take care. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great week.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.